Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming. We're so grateful to have each of you here with us today. And as guests here today, we have some asks of you. So we're using a Zoom meeting format to make this an interactive gathering. So please use the speaker view and stay muted until the Q&A, but please introduce yourself in the chat, who you are, where you are, and as the webinar proceeds, we encourage you to ask questions and write comments in the chat, and there will be Q&A times throughout. My name is Sarah Newman. I'm the founder of the Climate Mental Health Network, which is a new organization working to address the mental health effects of climate change through media and tech tools, community engagement, and education. I want to thank Blue Shield of California for its leadership on this issue. I'd reached out to Antoinette Mayer at Blue Shield of California many months ago about Blue Shield's research on this issue, and it's just incredible to be at this point here today. So a huge thank you also to the Sea Change Institute for your incredible team and work on the report and this webinar. It's been an honor to work with everyone at Blue Shield of California and the Sea Change Institute. I'm joined today by Dr. Jennifer Christian-Herman of Blue Shield of California, which generously funded this work. And I'm also joined by Dr. Larissa Dooley, who is a research psychologist at the Sea Change Institute and was the lead author of the report upon which this webinar is based. First, Jennifer will say a few words, and then we will turn it over to Larissa, who will do the bulk of the presentation, and there will be time for Q&A during the event. So please use the chat to submit questions and comments.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So my name is Jennifer Christian-Herman. I'm the Interim Vice President of Mind-Body Medicine at Blue Shield of California, and so excited to be a part of this webinar today and really honored to be able to support this important work. I've been at Blue Shield about a year, and I came here in part because of Blue Shield's deep commitment to youth mental health. In 2019, we launched our Blue Sky initiative, which focuses on understanding root causes of youth mental health issues and focus on resources and tools and care to support youth where they are, whether that's in schools or over the past couple of years, not in schools, and also committed to just better understanding the issue of youth mental health and what are some of the drivers of stresses and anxiety and depression that youth are facing. And on our survey last year, eco-anxiety was something that came out loud and clear, had a significant impact alongside, of course, COVID and social isolation and some of the other things that might initially come to mind. So when we had this opportunity to support this research, we were, as I said, really honored to do so, and definitely look forward to hearing more about it today. You know, like anything, having good data helps us to understand the magnitude of the issue. It also helps us to understand how we can change policy and how we can build interventions that can help. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Dr. Larissa Dooley, and look forward to participating.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Sarah, for the lovely introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This week is actually the week of the Youth Global Climate Strike, so it's a fitting time to be doing this talk. And first, before we get started, I just wanted to give you a brief word about Sea Change Institute, which is the research institute that I'm privileged to get to work for. Oh, yes? Oh, sorry, I think someone was unmuted. So I was trained as an academic. I have a PhD in psychology, but when I graduated, I really wanted to not just study and understand the world's problems, but also have the opportunity to help solve them. And that's exactly what we're able to do at Sea Change. We're a group of mostly PhDs who still work in the academic world. We go to conferences, we write papers, but we also work with real world partners, governments, NGOs, and socially oriented companies to help solve real world problems, in particular in the areas of environmental justice and human health. And I also want to mention that while I'm doing this presentation, the work that I'm presenting today is really the hard work of a much larger team here at Sea Change. Most of them are here today. Dr. Joanna Sheets, Olivia Hamilton, Dr. Dan Chapman, and Dr. Beth Carlin, our CEO. And I also want to acknowledge our partners, Blue Shield of California, the Climate Mental Health Network, who you just heard from, also the Global Fund for Mental Health, and also importantly, the experts and practitioners who we consulted with for this project and who really provided key insights and additions to this work. Some of them I know are also here today. Okay, so let's get started. As an overview, first, we'll talk about the problem. How is climate change impacting the mental health of young people? And next, we'll talk about what we can do about it. So what are some key strategies for helping support young people coping with the psychological impacts of climate change? And then finally, we'll talk about existing resources and future directions in this work. Note that this webinar is based on a report that's over 100 pages long, so we're just going to hit some key highlights here in this talk, but please know that there's a lot of information and detail in the full report, which is available on our website. I think Olivia, my colleague, is putting the link to the report in the chat. And also, I'm going to pause after the second section to take a few questions. So, and then we'll have time for a more in-depth Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions or comments as I go along, feel free to put them in the chat as you think of them, and we can address them either in the middle or at the end of the talk. Okay, so let's start with the problem. Climate change is negatively impacting the mental health and well-being of young people. How is this occurring? Well, first, living through a climate change related disaster, a wildfire, a flood, a storm, can be really traumatic. It can lead to major losses, the loss of a loved one, a pet, a home, a family business, all of which can cause significant stress and mental health issues, such as post-traumatic stress and trauma, depression, and anxiety. Additionally, even individuals who haven't been directly impacted by a climate disaster yet, and we know that this proportion of people is quickly narrowing, but even those that haven't been directly impacted can still experience significant psychological pain over the reality of climate change. Just knowing that climate change is happening, that it's already causing suffering and loss all over the world, can take a serious psychological toll. So this can be watching climate disasters play out on the news, learning about environmental problems in school, or witnessing negative changes in your environment, like this photo of the kids at the beach after an oil spill. All of this can cause real grief and turmoil. So I want to show you a brief clip that can be a little emotional to watch, but I can sit here and talk about this stuff as an academic, but I think it's really powerful to hear from a young person directly as a kind of reminder of what we're really talking about here and what's really at stake. So the clip I'm going to show you is from a video of a 6-year-old boy in the car with his mother and his siblings after he watched a documentary in school about environmental problems.
The planet is going to be wrecked. People are just being rude to it. They throw trash on the ground. They cut down trees. They make forests into places, into roads. They need to think about what they are doing, what they are doing to the planet, what they are doing to animals.
They're being so bad, he says. So if that video was emotional for you to watch, you're not alone. I've watched it several times and it never gets easier. It's upsetting what's going on, and it's upsetting how it's affecting young people. And I think we do well to remember that when we feel upset about something, that's a signal that something's wrong and that something really needs to change. Research suggests that young people, including children, but also adolescents and young adults, may be particularly vulnerable to the mental health impacts of climate change. And this is for a few different reasons. First, their nervous systems are still developing, rendering them more vulnerable to the effects of intense stress. Adolescence, for example, we know is a key period for the emergence of psychopathology. Additionally, young people have often not fully developed the emotion regulation or resilience resources they need to effectively cope with intense stress, like the stress of climate change. Also, young people are poised to bear the brunt of climate change. For example, recent research has projected that today's children will experience 3 times the number of climate disasters in their lifetime compared with their grandparents. A growing body of research shows that young people are being profoundly impacted by the psychological toll of climate change. So there was a recent global study that was released just this past December. It was the largest of its kind, and it surveyed 10,000 young people ages 16 to 24 across 10 countries, including the United States, and including both developed and developing countries. I know some of the co-authors are on this call right now. And what this study found was really sobering. A full 75% of the young people surveyed said the future is frightening. 56% felt that humanity is doomed. A full 55% felt that the things I value most will be destroyed. 39% were hesitant to have children. And 39%, importantly, felt that when I try to talk about climate change, other people have ignored or dismissed me. So I talked about how young people are particularly vulnerable to the mental health impacts of climate change. Another group that's particularly at risk for climate mental health impacts are communities of color. People of color and low-income communities are exposed to significantly more pollution and environmental risk compared with wider, more affluent communities. This is the reality that we refer to as environmental injustice. And this greater exposure to pollution and climate disasters, compounded by pre-existing stressors such as poverty and racism and racial violence, can lead to a significantly higher risk for mental health impacts. There's really a dramatic lack of research on how the psychological toll of climate change may be greater based on race or ethnicity, but there was a study out of Yale and George Mason University that looked at concerns about climate change and found that Latino and Black Americans were more likely to be alarmed or concerned about global warming compared with white people, supporting the idea that these groups may be worrying about climate change more and that it may be impacting their mental health more than their white counterparts. And it's important to note that climate anxiety and grief are not, for most people, pathological conditions. So unlike something like generalized anxiety disorder, which is characterized by persistent and excessive worry that's really out of proportion with the actual circumstances, feeling intense anxiety and grief about climate change is actually a really reasonable and rational response to a very real existential threat. And this is illustrated in this cartoon where the doctor is saying, here's your problem. It looks like you're paying attention to what's going on. Okay, so what can we do? How can we help people cope with the psychological impacts of climate change, in particular young people? Well, first, we need to kind of think about what the goals should be of interventions for climate anxiety. And one thing we know is that the goal should not be to eradicate negative emotions about climate change. It would be strange not to feel bad about this grave threat to the planet and the survival of humanity. But the goal instead is to not be debilitated or sort of paralyzed by our feelings. And this brings us to the idea of emotional resilience, that it can be defined as the ability to tolerate negative feelings without being sort of taken down by them. And a second goal, I think, is to really remove emotional barriers to action. I think there's kind of a misconception in this area of work that when we're helping people to cope with their emotions around climate change, that the benefits are limited to the person's mental health. That sure, we're helping the person feel better, and that in itself is very important, but we're not actually helping to mitigate the underlying problem of climate change, the actual source of their distress. And I really strongly disagree with that view, because so many people in our culture are really just paralyzed by their fears and their sense of overwhelm about the scope of the problem. And I think by giving people tools to help cope with the intense emotional response that this crisis can elicit, we can help remove barriers to action So we're not just helping people feel better. And again, that in itself is critically important. I'm a psychologist. I wouldn't be that if I didn't think mental health was important. But we're also freeing people from the sort of emotional paralysis that is preventing them from really doing something about the problem. So the issue that we have with answering this question of what can we do about climate anxiety is that research on intervention strategies is extremely limited and really virtually non-existent. In the past few years, there's been an emergence of resources and programs for individuals struggling with climate anxiety. These resources have been developed not just by researchers and clinicians, but also by educators and community leaders and even artists. But virtually none of them have ever been evaluated, so we really don't know how effective they are. Additionally, programs that aren't psychologically informed have the potential to do more harm than good. We ran across, in our review of the existing resources and programs, we ran across a few that could potentially fall into this category. So we don't kind of want to jump headlong into any program. We want to kind of proceed carefully. So if none of the programs that are out there for climate anxiety have been tested, how can we sift through this pool of resources and really figure out which ones are worthwhile? Which one would we want to participate in or recommend to our students or our patients or our teenage kid who's struggling with climate anxiety? So even though we don't have any empirical data on what works to help support people with climate anxiety specifically, we do know what works for related things, issues like trauma, depression, and anxiety. And we also know what clinicians, mental health practitioners who've been helping support patients struggling with climate anxiety and grief for many years now, what they say seems to really work based on their clinical experience. These are people like Carolyn Hickman, Thomas Doherty, Leslie Davenport. So after speaking with clinicians and drawing from gold standard approaches for related emotional issues and considering themes that were common across climate anxiety interventions, we developed a framework of 7 core components of promising interventions. And these are strategies and tools that we identified that seem to be fundamental to dealing with climate emotions. And you might think of them almost as sort of building blocks of interventions. The first of these core components is acknowledging and validating feelings. So this involves initiating conversations about the emotional impact of climate change, providing a safe and supportive space for the expression of emotions, and then normalizing these feelings by pointing out that these emotions are really a natural response to a frightening situation, that many people across the globe share these feelings. And this is especially important as research shows that young people often feel that they have no one to talk to about their worries. And that when they do try to talk to other people, especially the grown-ups in their lives, their concerns are ignored, brushed off, belittled, or sort of other research has shown that often grown-ups will kind of put the onus of responsibility on the young person and say, okay, well, what should we do about it? Kind of making them have to kind of come up what to do. So this sort of piece of acknowledging, validating feelings and really just allowing for the safe expression of them is really important. There are a number of different, so the second component is emotional coping tools. And there are really a number of different emotional coping tools used by clinicians and interventions for dealing with climate emotions. This is really the broadest sort of the components. We chose to focus on just a few here for the sake of time, but some that have been shown to be impactful and useful are mindfulness-based strategies, mindfulness-based stress reduction, for example, gratitude and finding meaning in climate change. So, for example, even though acknowledging that even though climate change is causing a lot of negative changes around the world, that it's also perhaps providing the impetus to make much needed societal changes. And also reframing. And this comes in part from the work of Carolyn Hickman, who points out that when we use the term climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, we're really engaging the rhetoric of pathology. So instead, it sounds like we're sort of pathologizing the person by saying you have climate anxiety. And instead, if we sort of reframe it, and if we understand and point out to our patients or our students or whoever we're talking to that if they have bad feelings about climate change, and all the strife that climate change is causing across the world, that means that they're really a compassionate person, that they care about the planet and all of its creatures, that they feel connected to the planet. So Carolyn Hickman has suggested calling it not climate anxiety, but climate compassion or climate empathy. And she says that reframing it in this way can really help her patients kind of embrace these feelings rather than sort of resist them. And that it sort of changes their relationship to those emotions. Another component here is social connection. So there's a wealth of research showing that connecting and feeling supported and cared for by others has benefits for mental health as well as physical health, and is a major source of resilience. Connecting with nature is another important component. Research suggests that spending time in nature can calm the nervous system, engage the parasympathetic nervous system, lower stress, reduce rumination. There was a review of interventions for the treatment of eco-anxiety, and in that review, connecting with nature was the sole focus of a full quarter of interventions reviewed, attesting to the clinicians' faith in the effectiveness of this strategy. I do want to mention a caveat here, which is that for many Black Americans, the idea of connecting with nature can really be fraught with complexity, because violence towards Black Americans has often occurred historically in wilderness spaces, and because of a long history of discrimination and exclusionary policies at national parks and other wilderness spaces. So suggesting that Black Americans connect with nature as a means of helping with climate emotions may be sort of marred with complexity that may need to be addressed. Another component that we identified is climate action, engaging in climate activism. This is probably the most powerful and efficient strategy for combating climate anxiety, because activism can simultaneously target the emotions as well as the underlying threat by potentially helping to mitigate climate change itself. At its core, I would say climate distress often involves feelings of uncontrollability and helplessness, and activism can address these feelings by helping individuals gain a sense of agency and empowerment. I also want to note that climate action can take a lot of different forms. So it's not just marching outside of City Hall, but it can also involve making lifestyle changes, lobbying for more sustainable practices at work or at school, publicly boycotting destructive businesses. Sarah Ray suggests sort of identifying your personal sphere of influence, all the places in your sort of personal and professional life where you have influence, and engaging in climate activism in those spaces. And it's important to note that engaging in climate action is really only beneficial for mental health when it's done in a balanced way. So in conjunction with some of the other techniques here, like after acknowledging and processing emotions, and also taking breaks and engaging in self-care to sort of balance the heaviness that can occur when you're kind of persistently and constantly engaging in climate action. So that leads me to self-care. Self-care can include going for a run, cooking a meal, taking a nap, really engaging in any activity that triggers positive feelings and a sense of well-being. Physical activity is often seen as a key part of self-care. We know from extensive research that physical activity helps regulate mood and is beneficial for facing major chronic stressors like climate change. Also, maintaining other healthy habits such as good sleep and eating habits can buffer the negative effects of stress. And finally, climate justice awareness. So this involves cultivating an awareness that climate change disproportionately affects certain communities, in particular Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and disadvantaged communities. For people who identify as a member of one of these groups, this might involve understanding how your climate emotions may be exacerbated by other overlapping chronic stressors. And for those who don't identify with these groups, it might involve taking the time to understand these issues, identifying your personal stance on them, and resolving to become part of a just solution. And just a note about this framework in general, ultimately, existing interventions really need to be tested to see how effective they are. until that happens, we see this framework as having the capacity to be used as a kind of litmus test. So interventions that utilize many of these components and are executed well are probably pretty solid. And we also see this framework as a kind of blueprint for designing programs for climate anxiety. If you're going to, design a program or an intervention to support people grappling with climate anxiety, or if you're just looking for some tools to use with your students or your patients, your kids, or yourself, these strategies are a great place to start. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for some questions, to take any questions. We're also really interested if people have feedback on this model. We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on that. It's something we're interested in continuing to develop and publish on. So we'd love thoughts and comments.
So I'm gonna share some of the questions that were in the chat, and thank you everyone for your questions. The first question for you, Larissa, is how can we message the severity of the issues in a way that is less traumatizing and more instillation of hope for children and teens? And I'm going to tie that to one other question, which was about education. And the question is, would love to hear some thoughts on how environmental educators can avoid doing harm, increasing students' ego distress in the classroom. Students often share that learning more facts about climate change and climate disasters in school makes them feel more distressed.
So sort of generally about how do we message in a way that's sort of less distressing for students and kids? Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and I love this question. In the future directions section, the next section, kind of towards the end, I'll talk about this as an area for research, really, for how to communicate with kids in a more positive way that's not distressing. I think so. There is a really great book by Leslie Davenport. I have it next to me at my desk all the time. So I think there's a picture of it in the slides, but it's called All the Feelings Under the Sun, which is a really great resource for communicating climate change in a way that's really developmentally appropriate for young people. So it's aimed at tweens. I would say, I think the official publisher says it's, maybe 10 to 14. I would say it's probably, I use it with my daughter who's 8. So I think it can go skew a little younger, so maybe 8 to 14, but it really kind of talks. So what she does in this book is she offers information about climate change. So perhaps there's a chapter on climate justice, so environmental injustice, and so she talks about how Black Americans tend to be and other disadvantaged groups tend to be disproportionately affected by climate change, and in a kind of not really traumatizing. So the language is a bit softened, but then also importantly, kind of offers immediately after space to acknowledge the feelings that information may have caused in the child, and then immediately provides tools to help cope with those emotions. And then before moving on to sort of the next lesson. So I think it's a technique called toggling that Leslie Davenport uses with, in her clinical practice as well, where you kind of move between difficult information and then balance it with sort of a break, basically a break to talk about emotions, to deal with them, and also just kind of to clear the air a little bit, and maybe you even do some physical exercises to kind of shake it off, or that kind of thing to get rid of sort of the somatic weight that might have caused. There's an interesting article by I think it was in a Carolyn Hickman piece where she quotes a kid who it's a qualitative piece where she's asking kids about how they think should parent, do you want grownups to tell you the truth about climate change? And they all say, yes, we want to be told the truth. And one of them that she quotes says, tell me the truth, but don't tell it all at once. And it's really interesting that she said that, I think, because she's really kind of got at this idea of toggling, like tell me, but then give me a break before telling me more. And so I think breaking it up is good. We also have, my daughter is part of she started this environmental group for kids, and it's really become a family kind of environmental group called Future Fighters. And we really focus on sort of the solutions in that group. I think really focusing on what we can do about it, and helping to kind of instill, and I think it really depends on the age, but helping to instill kids with sort of an understanding of how they're part of the solution, and giving them sort of also, helping to instill a real connection to nature that will kind of be a fundamental, that kind of provides the foundation that we can build action on, really, helping to connect them at a young age with nature, and understanding how we're connected and interdependent with nature and animals and the planet. Did that answer the components of, did that answer both those questions?
We have more, but we can, if you'd like to if you want to continue, or I don't know if you wanted to respond to a few more questions or do more at the end.
Yeah, just looking at our timing. I think we have, yeah, let's go on and we'll take some more at the end. Okay. So I'm going to briefly mention a few resources and programs that currently exist for coping with climate emotions, and then I'll talk about future directions and needs in this area. In our review of the landscape of existing interventions and resources, we identified 4 categories of resources. These are clinical resources, so resources for both training mental health practitioners and for patients seeking professional support. Community resources, so resources that can be used in community settings like support groups. Educational resources, so things that can be used in the classroom like curriculum and toolkits. And media resources, so books, podcasts, films, social media. And I'll really only be able to mention a few of these resources for the sake of time, but please refer to the report for a much more extensive discussion. And we also created something that we're calling the Climate Mental Health Resource Library that you can access on our website, and that has a much more extensive listing of available resources. There's also a place on the site, I believe, Olivia, you can confirm this, but where you can contact us if you know of resources that should be added to the library, and we can add them. Okay, so the first resource I'll mention is from the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. It's a directory for individuals looking to find a climate-aware therapist in their area. A climate-aware therapist is a psychotherapist professionally trained who recognizes the impacts of climate change on mental health and can provide psychological services to attend to this distress. Next, I wanted to mention a resource for training clinicians. Thomas Doherty, a pioneering psychotherapist in this field, is offering climate therapy consultations to help train and better equip therapists to support their patients who are grappling with mental health issues related to climate change. In terms of community resources, the Good Grief Network offers support groups, which are run by trained facilitators that provide a safe space for the sharing and processing of emotions around climate change. These groups also aim to help individuals to reorient their lives towards meaningful climate action. And in the realm of education, hopefully this will help answer whatever I didn't answer before. The Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators is a really extensive resource that aims to provide educators with tools to better support their students' emotional responses to learning about climate change and environmental injustice in the classroom. It's really aimed mostly, I think, at higher education, so sort of college level. There may be also sort of high school level, but it's for sort of older adolescents and young adults mostly. And it includes class activities and exercises, syllabi for the classroom, all with the aim of providing educators with the tools to help them integrate climate emotions and climate justice into the classroom. It was created by some great scholars and leaders in this field: Sarah Ray, who I mentioned, Dr. Jennifer Atkinson, Ellen Kelsey, and Robin Hutchings. And finally, in terms of media resources, there's that book I talked about, by Leslie Davenport. I really think of her as sort of the Obi-Wan Kenobi of the climate anxiety field. But as I mentioned, it provides sort of a great resource for younger kids, about 8 to 14. And the other book I'll mention is Sarah Ray's A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. Ray's been a professor of environmental studies for over a decade, and this book offers a really compelling argument about the importance of considering emotions when we teach environmental education, both to avoid causing negative mental health impacts in our students and also to better empower young people to act rather than paralyzing them with fear. Okay, so next, let's talk about future directions in this area. So as I just mentioned, there are a lot of resources and programs that have begun to emerge for coping with climate anxiety. At the same time, recent survey work tells us that the majority of youth are continuing to suffer and that worries about climate change continue to escalate. So this tells us that there's still really a lot of work left to be done. And we identified 5 key areas where this work we believe is really needed. The first one is in the area of research. So there's a strong need to examine racial and ethnic differences in climate emotions. Very few studies, it's shocking kind of how few studies have examined differences in climate anxiety across different racial and ethnic groups. And this is really important because first, we know that there are strong racial and ethnic differences in the impacts of climate change. And second, because an understanding of the potentially unique experiences of climate anxiety among, for example, Black Americans is needed to design effective interventions to support these communities. If we don't have an understanding of the needs of these groups, we can't design good interventions to support them. Second, research is needed to identify best practices for communicating climate change information to young people, in particular children and adolescents. We have to find ways to communicate this information in age-appropriate, emotionally supportive ways that don't instill fear, but rather motivate and empower young people. And I just want to emphasize here that I'm not in any way suggesting that we shouldn't talk to kids about climate change because it might be too upsetting. I think that, maybe at the very, very youngest ages, but once, kids are sort of in elementary school, even, the realities of climate change are just too pervasive to go undetected even by kids. So they're going to hear about it, and they need to hear about it first from the people that they trust. So we need to find developmentally appropriate ways of communicating about that. Young people's responses to climate change. So the second sort of area for future directions and opportunities, I think, is in family-based programs. Young people's responses to climate change really can't be understood outside of the context of their parents or caregivers. We know that when young people are aware of climate change, but their parents aren't talking to them about it or doing anything about it, this can really cause a lot of confusion and a sense of isolation in young people. Conversely, when parents are thinking about it a lot and really anxious about it and having a lot of their own emotions about it, and not dealing with those emotions appropriately, this can really spill over and trigger anxiety in their kids. So all of this speaks to the need for family-based interventions where parents and kids can really come together with other families and talk openly about climate change and their emotions. Engage in climate action together, parents and their children side by side with other families. These photos are actually from the family-based group that I mentioned that I do with my family and some of our friends and my daughter's friends, called Future Fighters. School-based approaches are a really promising means, I think, of spreading awareness about the climate crisis in developmentally appropriate ways, while at the same time helping students process climate-related emotions and promoting resilience. School curriculums represent a promising intervention strategy as schools provide really reliable access to many young people at once, and importantly, to diverse groups of young people. So I mentioned a couple times now the family-based group that my family's involved with, Future Fighters. And what I've noticed with that group is that we're really only accessing families that are already interested in climate action, that really opt into that experience. And the great thing about school programs is that you can access a lot of kids at once, sort of whether they asked for it or not. And school programs are also promising because they hold the potential for really being rapidly scaled. You could imagine a program or curriculum being implemented in a single school and then being rolled out across a district or even a state. I also want to mention here a study that many of you may know about that's really interesting that came out in 2019 from Danielle Lawson and her colleagues that found they did a intervention, or they did a study where they we're really targeting parents, trying to change attitudes and concern about and raise concern about climate change to get them motivated to act. And they did it through teaching their kids. So they taught middle school age children. It was in North Carolina. It was an educational intervention where they taught them about the problems of climate change. And then they measured their parents' changes in attitudes, and they found that young people, that were really effective communicators and really effective, at they called it child to parent learning, this sort of intergenerational learning, that they really were effective at changing their parents' minds and helping raise awareness about the issue with their parents, particularly girls or daughters. Were very effective. The effect size was biggest with daughters influencing their fathers, and in particular conservative fathers made the biggest change in their attitudes and concerns. Another opportunity here is climate circles. So climate circles involve gatherings of people who convene to share and process their feelings about climate change. This can happen in person or online, and can be led by trained facilitators or can be peer-to-peer. And we think that the expansion of these climate circles has potential because they're relatively easy to implement. They can be implemented in a variety of settings, in person or online, and can really help normalize conversations about climate change and climate emotions. And in order to reach youth and young adults from diverse backgrounds, climate circles could be formed at schools or youth serving organizations like Boys and Girls Clubs, at church youth groups, or through social media channels. Finally, climate training for clinicians. So there's currently very little training for clinicians on how to support patients struggling with mental health issues related to climate change. There was a 2016 study that found that more than half of therapists who were interviewed felt that their training had not adequately equipped them to deal with the mental health impacts of the climate crisis. So training and enhanced clinical assessments can help clinicians avoid pathologizing reasonable responses to the climate crisis, while also identifying those struggling with more serious issues that meet criteria for mental health disorders. Given the rapid increase in climate anxiety and grief, training methods that can be scaled quickly are the most helpful for development. Training and support for mental health professionals can take a lot of different forms. We could have web-based trainings, workshops, toolkits that are sort of downloadable and shareable. And to wrap up, I just want to briefly return to the video of the young boy crying about the state of the planet. Some of you may have noticed what was going on in the background of that video. The boy was crying, and then his brother next to him started crying. And then the baby started crying. And I point that out because I think that's really emblematic in some ways of what's going on in a larger sense in our culture right now. People are anxious, they're grieving, and these feelings are really contagious. We know that as psychologists, that's the principle of co-regulation, right? That people align to one another's emotions, to their feelings. But that can also really happen in reverse. When we can start to help people, especially young people, build emotional resilience in the face of climate change and motivate and inspire them to action, this too is contagious. And I say this because I really want to emphasize the potential impact of this work For every one young person that we can directly help through, say, a school program or a family-based program, we're also helping their siblings and their parents and their friends at school. In the words of Abigail Dillon, the president of Earth Justice, this moment is alive with possibility. Thank you. So we have some time for questions. But first, if you want more information about this or other projects, you can visit our website. As I mentioned, you can read and download the full report that this webinar is based on the website. We have the mental health resource library, climate mental health resource library, and you can also email me if you want to connect or collaborate. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can open it up to questions and discussion. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll respond, and my team members can also respond to as many as we have time for.
Thank you so much, Larissa. That was great. And thank you to everyone who's been sharing and commenting in the chat and asking questions. So there was a few questions that had come up earlier that I know you didn't get to have a chance to get to before. So we'll start with those. And I'm going to combine one. One is when you were talking about the seven core components, the 7 most promising interventions. Could you say more how these were decided? And also, could you say more, this was back towards the beginning, about what kinds of ego distress coping programs you came across that have the potential to cause harm, in your opinion?
Oh, yeah. So the core components, we decided on those based on talking to, so basically we were charged with this task of, we were writing this report based on, a scope. We were doing a research review of the problem of climate anxiety. And then we were doing a landscape assessment. This is what we offered to Blue Shield. When they contacted us, we said, we'll look at all the resources that are out there and tell you the best ones. And then when we started to do that, we were like, well, we don't know how do we know which are the best ones? Because none of them have actually been tested. There's been one study really from 2015, I think it was, of a Carbon Conversations intervention that showed that it was effective at helping people cope with the emotional components. And that's really kind of, full stop where the intervention evaluations end. And so we really were kind of coming at it from this direction of like, okay, well, how do we sort of know which are, the best ones to kind of promote and to spread the word about here, because none of them have been tested. And so we took this approach of, well, we don't know, a lot about the interventions as a whole, but we do know about sort of the components of the intervention. Some, there's research to, we don't know, the Good Grief Network, for example, hasn't been tested, but we know that sort of acknowledging, validating feelings is something that they do, and that has been shown to be useful. Or connecting with nature, that has been shown to be useful. So we were looking at, first of all, kind of the components that were common across interventions, and then seeing which were sort of evidence-based. So which of those components, like nature-based therapy, for example, or connecting with nature, have been shown to be effective for either for climate anxiety specifically. So in the case of nature, there have been a few studies that have looked at effectiveness for climate anxiety specifically and found that to be effective. And also that have benefits sort of broadly for related issues like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress. And so we were kind of pulling on kind of evidence-based strategies that have worked for related issues, or if there was evidence showing effectiveness for climate anxiety specifically, we pulled on that evidence as well. And then we also talked to clinicians. Our expert interviews were very valuable. We talked to people about what seems to work from your point of view, in the therapist's office, and got a lot of insights that way. So that's how we came to those core components. But we're interested in sort of a discussion about, what could be added or refined. And it will be interesting also to see as research develops, as more comes out, how it can be kind of revised and added to and refined. Oh, the second question was about harm. I think I don't want to sort of point to certain things specifically, but there was an intervention strategy, I'll just kind of speak broadly, that was developed by, just sort of community members, and had kind of taken calls from people who are distressed about climate and about climate change. And they had recorded the calls and kind of listening to them. The first couple that we listened to, someone had called in and said, "I'm really worried about climate change." And the person on the other end of the line who was taking the call was like, "Oh, that must be very hard for you. That seems like that's very hard for you." And it seemed, and you could hear in the caller's voice that they felt a little bit taken aback, because really climate change is something that we all share and that we're all coping with together. And so it's, if you've ever had a conversation with, when you were upset with your partner or a friend and they've said the wrong thing, that can really kind of do harm, that it can cause kind of a sense of separation rather than connection with other people, and it can make you feel more isolated rather than helping to kind of ease your psychological pain that you're coping with in that moment. Okay, what else, Sarah?
We have lots more in the chat, but I see Theopia Jackson has a raised hand, so I'm gonna turn it over to her.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. And my apologies, I'm not able to be on camera. I want to thank the organizers for this event and a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I'm really enjoying this. I wanted to offer a request, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about it as the thought leaders in this field. I appreciate throughout the talk that you reference the, quote, unique experiences for people of color, particularly Black. However, what my question would be, or my ask would be, is could you be more explicit in simply saying that the interplay between climate change and structural racism, because that's how it manifests itself in those communities? What I worry about as someone who's been in the trenches working on the ground with our people is that when you just list those differences, it makes it not your intention, but the impact is it makes it sound like it's a problem that belongs to them versus it's something that's happening to them. And then I'll just also close by saying, from a holistic approach, when I think about the communities I'm working in, we are so exhausted trying to do the work of getting rights in general that if you don't be more explicit about climate change, it feels like something separate when it's not, when there's truly an intimacy between climate change and social justice. So I just wanted to, given the positions you're in and the power that you're doing, I'd just be curious if you could, again, consider leading with the intimacy of climate change and structural racism, and this is how it manifests itself in communities of color. I'm just curious of your thoughts. And again, thank you for this webinar and for everyone who's doing the work. I love the resources shared. So just wanting to help the conversation keep moving forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. And thank you for being here and bringing that up. I think that's great feedback. And I think that we're really coming to understand that climate change and social justice issues are one and the same, that a lot of, climate change would not be happening if it weren't for a lot of, if we couldn't put polluting industries in Black neighborhoods, then we probably wouldn't have them, because no one else would, if these things are happening by design, that, that it's not an accident that that Black people are disproportionately affected, that these industries are actually being put in these neighborhoods on purpose. And if we treated low income communities, even any sort of marginalized communities where these are being placed, if we treated it the way that we treat more affluent neighborhoods, then there would be no place to put these polluting industries, and I think they wouldn't be allowed to persist. So I think it's really an area that I'm learning a lot more and growing a lot more about, and I'd love to open the discussion. I mean, I know that there's Jelana's here, Jade Sasser's here. I mean, I think that there are a lot of more qualified people to speak to this than I, but I think it's great feedback. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to just make one comment. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for pointing that out. And I do want to note that, like, in the report, we do speak to that intersectionality and the fact that, like, structural racism and other structural factors like do play a role. And so just in our interviews, as I mentioned in the chat with Dr. Jade Sasser and Jacqueline Patterson, they kind of like brought this to life. And one of the things that one of the quotes that Jacqueline Patterson says often is that there is no single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. And that's from Audre Lorde. And so that kind of guided our thinking in writing the report, and it kind of brought it to the forefront of our minds. So we totally agree with you on that. And I think that just in the presentation couldn't fit everything in, but I do agree with you that, that is something that should be pointed out specifically, whether it's, in a report or in a presentation, just to bring that awareness to everyone. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in one more comment, just kind of leveling up even from this project, something that I'm thinking a lot about, and we've been talking a lot about it at Sea Change and in other research projects is, I've been really deeply investigating this concept of decolonizing methodologies, and that these are both climate change and structural racism are colonizing forces, as is the traditional scientific paradigm that we're working under to study these problems, and which breaks things down into variables and it separates them, right? And so we're working on how we can better integrate multiple ways of knowing as scientists. And this is one of the projects where we came right up against that, right? We're looking at the scientific evidence on this issue and realizing that it elevates above and beyond the way science thinks about problems in the world. And so we're I think in a good way struggling and trying to be very comfortable in the discomfort around that, and welcome feedback and input and collaboration from anyone who can help us and work with us as we kind of bring what we were trained as scientists to bear without carrying along the assumption that it in and of itself is going to help without kind of these decolonizing ideas around our methodologies and our science.
We're almost at time. I did want to mention we have a brief survey if people would feel comfortable filling it out. We also are hoping to compile the questions that were asked in the chat today that we didn't get to. We're going to send out an email after the webinar with a recording of the webinar, a link to our report. The survey will be in there as well if you don't have time to do it now. And we'll also respond to the questions that weren't responded to, that we didn't have time for today at that time. And feel free to reach out if you're interested in contacting us for questions, collaboration ideas. We'd love to be in touch. This is work we all feel really passionate about. So thank you so much for joining today. Thank you again to Jennifer from Blue Shield for introducing, and to Sarah for hosting, and thank you all for being here.